I think we'll get started. Welcome to all of you to our virtual town hall on rural revitalization. I'm Ryan Gertz-Regier from the Kansas Rural Center. I'm the program and administrative manager here. And if you haven't ever joined a virtual town hall, you're welcome, enjoy. And we hope for those of you who have been to one before that you enjoy this one as well. The Kansas Rural Center has been around for a little over 40 years, and some of our main missions are the health of agriculture and sustainable agriculture and rural communities. And we have a long history of promoting the health of the land and its people through research, education, and advocacy. We do that on a state and a national level as well through the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, which we're a part of. And we do other things like farm tours, different research programs, instructional webinars, and programs like this to engage with people civically. So we are committed to an economically viable, environmentally sound, and socially responsible agriculture and rural culture in Kansas. So these town halls are kind of an extension of previous work that we've done in years past. In 2019, we had town halls in person, and out of those town halls came a couple of different topics, and that's what these 4 town halls this late summer and fall are over. And we want to engage the broader Kansas community in conversation about what's happening in your lives and in your communities, and ways that life can be made better for you and your families, and how Kansas moves forward from this point on. So we're working on a variety of current farm and food issues, and living in the current context of COVID-19, Black Lives Matter, and the upcoming election. So part of the town halls is voter engagement, and we'll have some information here from the League of Women Voters shortly. A couple weeks ago, we had our first town hall on local and regional food system resilience. This one is on rural revitalization. In 2 weeks, we'll have one on climate and energy. And then after that, on October 8th, we have the last of these town halls on the Farm to School program. We recently received a grant to work on Farm to School here in Kansas, so stay tuned for that, and that's an exciting project that we're taking on. You can find more information about any of these at our website, kansasruralcenter.org/2020 town halls. There's also a pre-town hall farm tour video. We did one last time of Grazing Plains Farm and Creamery down by Newton, and this week's pre-town hall farm tour video is of Prairie Turnip Farm. Our staff member Joanna Will and her husband Hank have a wonderful farm, and you can go over to our YouTube channel at Kansas Rural Center and view that and the previous one, as well as previous town halls and this town hall once it's done. I will make a note about the recording. We are planning to record this session and keep it for staff purposes. There is a built-in time in this town hall for community dialogue, and I just want you to know up front that we plan to cut the video off after the panelist discussion, so you needn't be afraid that comments you make after the panel discussion are going to be public on the internet for everybody to see. So, but we will want to keep that for some of our review and etc. While you're on our YouTube channel viewing those videos, if you want to hit the like and subscribe button, as the kids say these days, we'd appreciate it. And as always, you can subscribe to our newsletter to hear more from us if you'd like. So the flow of the evening here, like I said earlier, we're going to hear from the League of Women Voters here in just a moment. We have tonight's panel, and they'll be introduced shortly as well. And after that, we're going to have some Q&A and open discussion that may involve doing some breakout rooms here in Zoom if you're interested in that, or if there's enough interest in conversation just with the panelists here in this open session, we can just keep it that way as well. So some of the community questions we want to talk about towards the end of the session include: what concerns and issues do you bring tonight? What support do you need in your communities, in your context? And how are you going to take action after tonight? Those are questions we're interested in hearing about from you and talking about. So you can find us at a variety of places on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. As a couple of housekeeping things just before we get started, if you don't have your mic on mute, we'd ask that while people are presenting, you keep your mic muted. Video, you can leave on or off. There's no requirement to be seen during the whole meeting. If you have questions that come up while the panelists are speaking, you can feel free to type them into the chat. We'd appreciate holding any video questions where you actually want to speak until the end of the meeting so that you don't interrupt the panelists. If you have not been to many Zoom meetings before and you want to adjust how you're viewing the people shown on the video screen here, you should see some options in the upper right-hand corner of your screen for options like gallery view or grid video or active speaker video. So I think that's all the notes that I have to take care of here at the beginning. And we will hear from Teresa from the League of Women Voters talk about voting.
Thank you, Ryan. I really appreciate this opportunity. The League of Women Voters of Kansas really values and benefits from our partnership with the Kansas Rural Center. And we have access to Paul Johnson's insight of legislative issues and his reports, which we share with our members statewide. The League had different plans for this year, as it marks our centennial, but 2020 apparently had different ideas for all of us. Now in the midst of a pandemic, we have a major election coming up where we're going to be voting on federal, state, and the ever important local policymakers just in over a month and a half. So our mission, as stated, is to defend democracy and empower voters. So that's what we're doing at each opportunity available to us, such as this one. It's my understanding that these slides are going to be shared later on. And since one of my pet peeves is having someone read a PowerPoint to me when I can read it myself, I will make this quick, and because I'm looking forward to hearing the other speakers as well. So we'll go to the next slide, please, Ryan. There we go. Thank you. First of all, I've listed a few points of Kansas law related to voting that may or may not be common knowledge, such as the last one there with the conversation lately about mail ballots. We want to have voters keep in mind that if the postmark is what validates your ballot, you need to be aware that not all mail is postmarked, and depending on the time of day that you drop it off, it may not be postmarked until the next day. So there are some other points there that you can read at your leisure. Go to the next slide. These are just a listing of the type of IDs that are acceptable that you must bring with you when you go to vote. And at the bottom, certain people are exempted from that requirement. This list is also available on the Secretary of State's website, which has a lot of great information around voting, by the way. If you go to the tab that says elections, there's a lot of good information. Next slide, please. Vote411.org is a website that is funded by the League and kind of a one-stop shop when it comes to being able to register to vote, see where your polling place is, see what's on your ballot. The League composes questions and poses them to each of the candidates, and their answers are posted on 411 exactly as they submit it. We do not edit it, not even spelling errors. So we We want voters to be able to go on and see who's going to be on their ballot and see where they stand on the issues that are important to them. That way they can access that information, they're becoming a more informed voter, and it is available in both English and Spanish. Okay, next slide. Another website that we recommend a lot and have found helpful is ksvotes.org. As it says here, if you are using a cell phone or a tablet and you can sign on, you can register to vote or apply for an advanced ballot. And once you submit that information, it is sent directly to your county's election office. And then they will respond with a response to you that they've received it. So this is really handy. We use this a lot when we're at tabling events, when we used to be at tabling events, or at public events where we were registering people. We would have tablets and people could make sure that their registration was up to date, or they could register to vote or request a ballot right there. So that's another good website to check out. Next slide, please. So there are more people than usual requesting an advanced ballot, and the county clerks and the Secretary of State are providing ballot boxes or drop boxes, as they're referred to be more accessible to voters who are concerned about the efficiency of the mail, or if they just prefer not to go into their election officer's office to turn into their ballot. And then there is a statute saying that if you have a neighbor or a friend who has requested an advanced ballot but does not want to get out or can't get out, there is an area on the back of the ballot envelope where an individual can sign that they have not influenced the voter in any way and that they are delivering it on behalf of that voter, and that will be confirmed. Next slide. This is an important slide to keep in mind. These are all the relevant dates for you to have on hand to remind you of important deadlines related both to being able to register to vote. You can see that's the very first deadline coming up, as far as voting itself, and the last day to have mailed in ballots postmarked, etc. Okay, next slide. This is a great link to keep handy if you do use an advanced ballot. You can go onto this site to see when your request for an advanced ballot was received. And then there's a little timeline to show when they have sent it to you so that you can be watching for it. And then once they've received your completed ballot back, they will signify that on the little timeline. So it's really good to keep track to make sure that your ballot is moving along the way it should. And the last slide. These are just some things to know that are rights as a voter. We've seen lately images of lines stretching for hours at polls, but we want to stress that even when the polls close at 7 p.m., anyone that is in line has the right to vote. So do not be tempted to step away to grab something to eat or step out of line. Just be sure and stay in line, and you should be given the chance to vote. The last bullet is a phone number where you can call the ACLU, who has set up a nonpartisan election protection hotline that you can call at any time, tell them the issue that you're having and trying to vote or an experience that you've had, and they are going to have legal assistance on hand to help advise you. All right. Last slide is just the opportunity to ask questions or share any comments, points that I may have missed. I've given you our website, which we have information there as well, and my email is there. If you think of questions later, we're always happy to help in any way. And I, again, appreciate the opportunity.
Okay, thank you so much, Teresa. I'm not seeing any immediate questions for you here, so I'll move this over to Natalie now to introduce our panel, and we'll get going on that. Thank you very much.
All right, thanks Ryan, and thanks Teresa. I just want to add, I think a good key takeaway from Teresa's presentation and information she shared is to please share it with your friends, your family, your coworkers to make sure that they have those important dates and resources as we lead up to this election. It doesn't hurt to share them, and you never know who's not aware of those deadlines. So you can also find those. We have those posted on KRC's website, as well as a link to the League of Women Voters website and their resources as well. So with that, I would like to go ahead and introduce our panel for the evening. I'm actually going to turn things over to Ms. Sarah Green. Sarah Green has been a friend of KRC for a long time. She is a champion for rural Kansas. She is a rural Kansas advocate, a writer, and we just really enjoy working with Sarah and all of the things that she does for rural Kansas. So Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you because I think we're going to let all of our panelists introduce themselves this evening. So take it away, Sarah. Thank you.
Thanks, Natalie. Yes, so Sarah Green, as Natalie said, and I am just very proud to live and work in Kansas. I do live in Wichita, but I'm totally stealing this phrase. I am a rural aspirationalist. It is my dream to live in rural Kansas. But I have a special place in my heart for people who live and work in Kansas. And I love food systems, and I've had the opportunity to work with many of you on this call in that space as well. So I have the honor of facilitating this conversation this evening with some Kansans who are invited to share their own perspectives about where they live and where they work. And I'll ask them all to introduce themselves in just a minute. But first, I want to recognize the contributions that many of you made to this conversation. So if you registered ahead of time for this event, you were asked to provide some thoughts about what rural revitalization meant to you. And we looked through your answers, and there were kind of two main themes that emerged from the feedback that we received. So the first theme was that when we talk about rural revitalization, we should really think about promoting and celebrating what our rural communities do best. And that often looks like supporting local producers and businesses. The second theme is perfect for our panel, I think. Many of you mentioned the concept of sustainability, but a broad definition of sustainability. So some of you mentioned this in the context of food and agriculture and the environment, but a lot of other people talked about just needing sustainable components for the economy, like building and maintaining sustainable infrastructure, including broadband. Some of you talked about the need to sustain healthcare services, and then others talked about sustainable education services in rural areas. We're really lucky to have a lot of those perspectives represented this evening. So I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves one by one, and then we'll kind of get into this conversation. So you'll have a little bit of background about who everybody is. And because so many of us here love food, I've also asked them to please tell us their favorite thing to eat in Kansas. And it's open-ended, so it could be a dish, could be, you know, a place. In Kansas. So to kick us off, we'll start with who I think still might be, oh, there you go.
There you go. Okay, good. Sorry about that. I lost you there for a minute. So thank you, Sarah. I'm Lieutenant Governor Lynn Rogers. I don't think of myself as Lieutenant Governor all the time. I still think of myself being as a kid that grew up on a farm with 400 hogs. My wife and I live in Wichita. We were involved, you know, I was on the school board in Wichita for a number of years and also worked in the ag banking, financing world for about 30 years before I ran for the state Senate. Under Governor Kelly, I work on the Office of Rural Prosperity, and our priorities are to work on things that will help rural Kansas prosper, and those include housing, enhancing the housing operations or housing options, broadband, healthcare, including Medicaid expansion, and childcare are just some of the priorities. There's a lot of things to do, but we're kind of concentrating on those 4 areas. And the question about what is it that I like to eat, that is really a tough one because, you know, if you see me, you'll notice that I do like to eat, and sometimes I'm not always real picky, but between ice cream and pie, those are probably my favorite things to eat. And if you can combine the two together, I'm in really good shape. And there's, fortunately in Kansas, and particularly rural Kansas, there's a lot of great places that serve pie. And if I haven't found it yet, that's got to be an aspirational goal as well.
Great. Well, thank you. Andi, I'll let you go. Have you go next.
Good evening. My name is Andi Dale, and I'm in Protection, Kansas. I didn't grow up in Protection. I grew up in a larger city, excuse me, and took a teaching job out here about 25 years ago. And have been in and out of the classroom over the last 25 years. Very small rural school, total enrollment of about 300. My husband and I also farm and ranch, and we're pretty conventional for the first 10 or 15 years of our marriage, and over the last 10 years, we've made a switch to more regenerative types of practices. We grass finish cattle, pork, chicken, turkeys, just a little bit of everything, and then we direct market a large portion of what we raise, which provides some of its own hurdles living as far out here. We're an hour from a Walmart or McDonald's, if that gives you some Kansas perspective. When Sarah asked what my favorite Kansas food was, I would have to say probably anything that my husband raises. At the top of the list would probably be a filet. He's ruined me for a restaurant, but I would rather eat at home any day.
Great, thank you. Kendal, I'll ask you to go next.
Okay, thanks. My name's Kendal Carswell. I live in Garden City. Please excuse my voice. I grew up in northwest Kansas in a little town called Alton. It was a population of about 200 when I grew up. It's in Osborne County. Now it's a little under 100 people. I've kind of, I think, opposite aspiration of Sarah as I was growing up, was always wanting to leave rural Kansas. And as hard as I've tried, I've always ended up back here. So I resigned myself to the fact several years back that this must be where I belong. And I can't say that it's treated me bad. I actually love rural Kansas. I'm a professor at Fort Hays State University in the social work program. And I do some contract work with Kearney County Hospital in Lake, Kansas, about 20 miles west of Garden City. And I actually worked there for 3 years from 2015 through 2018, creating their social services program and writing grant proposals that I'll be able to share about tonight and how those kind of fit in with this conversation. I was fortunate enough to get right around $1.5 million over an 18-month period.
Great. And did you say your favorite food? Your favorite Kansas food?
I didn't. My physician put me on a strict diet, so I can't eat anything that I like. So everything sounds good right now. But I'll say a grilled prime rib. I could eat prime rib 4 times a day.
Great. Thank you. Matt, have you go next?
Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Matt O'Malley. I am a community liaison for Live Well, Crawford County. We're down here in the southeast corner of the state, home of the Pitt State Gorillas. Primarily, my work is through the Kansas Health Foundation's Healthy Communities Initiative, where we have, in the very small town of Arma, Kansas, population about 1481, formed a nutrition council and a very, very successful community garden. We've expanded and established food pantries. We're teaching nutrition education and really just doing a whole lot more other things, but as much as we can to try and just increase knowledge about and access to healthy foods. Another project I'm working on is a high tunnel in McCune, Kansas, even smaller, about 450 people. And this is going to be a really collaborative project in between a very small school, a church, a Lions Club, and a farm to market store, where the school kids will learn how to plant and grow and harvest their own food, and they'll actually get to sell it to the local store, who will in turn sell it to the community at a low cost. So those are the kinds of projects that I work on. My favorite food has got to be sweet corn. One, it's just like garden candy. I mean, it's just one of the best tastes that come out of a garden. And two, I have a 3-year-old boy, and it's one of the only foods that gets him to shut up for about 5 minutes. You give a kid an ear of sweet corn, and they really get focused in on that sweet corn, and it has brought peace to our dinner table. And so that'd be my favorite food. Thank you.
And thank you for the parenting advice as well. Ben.
Ben Whiteside. I live in rural Towanda, Kansas, on our family farm, built on our family farm. We leased our family farm out to kids that went to 4-H. Well, kids, they're adults now, obviously, but they went to 4-H, grew up with 4-H growing up, and they've got a farming business, so we leased out for their cattle and hay and everything. I work for Butler Electric Cooperative. We're a small distribution cooperative that provides electricity to Butler County and portions of the 6 of the surrounding counties. I've been involved with everything from finance to rate structures, anything related to technology. We've implemented a solar farm, and our latest project is a large broadband deployment, which we're about 2 years into, not quite 2 years into. Another thing, I've been involved with our local school board for about 24 years, a little over 24 years. So favorite food, I don't know how American it is. I like Mexican food, and there's no better appetizer than chips and salsa. So, but there's plenty of Mexican restaurants around, and lots of choices.
Great. And the corn, comes from that, so it's all
Exactly.
It's all good tied together. That's good.
It's all Kansas products, right?
Right. Well, thank you all for that. I was thrilled when Natalie told me that the format for this conversation was a conversation and not a series of presentations. I don't know about any of you who work in the new world of Zoom and just being tied to screens for so long. So I hope that this is interactive, and I hope that we get to hear, we have panelists from all across the state, and so many of the rest of you who are in listen mode for the time being are from across the state. So I hope that the next 40 minutes is engaging and entertaining and hopeful for the topic tonight. As Ryan said, if you have a question, we ask that you type it into the chat box, which is the little speech bubble at the bottom of your screen. I also want to recognize that there's apparently a sporting event this evening that is happening at the same time. So thank you all. We recognize you have many choices for how to spend your Thursday evening. So thanks for thinking about rural Kansas tonight. We just have a few questions for our panelists that we like them to consider. And the first one is really just thinking about where we are these days. As someone who does love rural Kansas and has been in a lot of conversations about rural Kansas in even just the last 10 years, I'm wondering where we are right now with the changing world. And so really just the first question, and I'll let the panelists pop in as they see fit. What is more important now for us to think about with rural communities? What's more important now than ever as we think about adapting to now and to the future?
You're not picking an order to get us to start it, right?
I'm going to have the introvert start, Andi, and I think that's
Okay.
you.
Well, because I've thought about it a long time as an introvert and how to phrase it. I think, especially as things have gotten particularly hard, not just this year, but over the last several years. And Protection is a town of about 450. There's less than 2,000 people in the county, and we're very, very rural. I think when things get harder, we tend to get stuck in nostalgia. I hear a lot of the way it used to be. We really miss this, or things have changed and we're not comfortable with that change. And so we get pulled back to thinking and remembering that time when we thought things were really good. Now, whether or not they felt like it to us at the time or looking back. And I think how we adapt and how we deal with that sounds very cliche, but I think we have to have some kind of flexibility in our thinking. We have to be able to imagine or look at and see something that looks different, that still meets those needs that we have, that might look very, very different than what we remember. And so there has to be that ability to imagine and be flexible in how we think, that the solutions that worked 10 years ago may not be the ones that work right now. And I see that in agriculture and I see that in education, both.
I would agree with what Andi's saying. In Garden City, of course, there's a lot of immigrants and refugees that live here, a large number of refugees. And, you know, a lot of it is wanting to have a sense of belonging to the community, especially within the refugee populations coming from Myanmar, numerous African countries in Africa. And you know, the majority of those folks are also working at the beef plants. And I know someone spoke last week around the beef plants and with the COVID-19 and all of that. And I know my friends, they were scared to death to go to work. And I know Tyson has been very supportive and has tried to put things in place. And I know they have some positive things moving forward right now. But I just know a lot of people, their anxiety levels off the charts. You know, I think people who are already isolated or even more isolated because of COVID. And it's how do we reach out and identify those folks, and how do we support them in managing their affairs, whatever that is, accessing food, healthcare, or whatever that might be. But a sense of including, I want to feel that I belong. And like Andi was saying, some people hold on to the past very strongly, and change is scary for them as well.
You know, we've been doing a number of our Office of Rural Prosperity listening tours, and we've had a number of breakout groups. The other night we spoke with child care providers. Today we talked with Medicaid expansion folks, hospital administrators, and whatnot. And the word that kept coming up in a lot of these different sessions is uncertainty. People don't know what to expect. And I really see that word, that concept really started long before COVID. You know, when I worked for the ag banking world, I traveled all over Kansas and drove in and out of little towns, worked with farmers and ranchers and their cooperatives all over the state. And then I retired in 2016 to run for the state Senate. And so I didn't do that traveling. I was just going back and forth to Topeka. And during the campaign for governor, lieutenant governor, I was back out on the road. And I noticed in those 2 years, and of course, a lot of it's because ag income really dropped during that period of time, the number of businesses in small towns really dropped. A lot of them closed. And so, you know, I think that was kind of the start of the uncertainty. It's part of what started the ORP office, because of that uncertainty and that concern. But I think a lot of it comes down to, you know, what's going to see us through this is really that word community. How do we, you know, build a community? Because right now, as a nation, as a state, as sometimes even as a county or a city, we don't want to be unified. We're mad at each other, tribalism sometimes, and we've got to figure out how do we build a community. You know, we don't have to agree 100%, but we probably do agree more than we disagree. And so how do we focus on those things? And set aside the disagreements so that we can work on them. There's no, we don't want to deny that, but we've got to figure out how do we do what's best for the community at large and not just for me individually.
I think I'll sort of piggyback on what the Lieutenant Governor said about businesses closing. And from our perspective, we've got to, what's more important now than ever is finding ways to make sure that food stays in these small communities. A lot of the times the business that closes the small town family run grocery store. And then before you know it, a gas station or a dollar store is the only place to buy your family's groceries. And that affects everybody that's in that community, rich or poor.
Yeah.
But low income households and homebound seniors, they're going to be far more impacted by that. It could really keep an entire community from being able to reach its full health potential. What happens and what we've seen happen in some of these small communities down here in Crawford County is that when that grocery store closes, people are really worried about the future of that town, and especially young families with kids. They're leaving. They're going somewhere to get closer to food for their family. So I think that we have to really get comfortable with experimenting and being okay with failing, coming up with lots of different creative approaches to get good food into small communities. There's so many ways to do that. And it sounds kind of silly, but like if you try 10 different things and 5 of them still work after a few years, like you did something good and you've improved their situation. And it's okay to fail, because then it's okay that maybe those 5 of them failed, because then you figured out, what really does work and what makes a difference, and you can pass that along to other communities.
Mm-hmm.
One of the areas of concern that we had is how to keep people in the rural areas, and what's keeping people from moving into rural areas. And that's one of the reasons why we decided to deploy broadband service in the rural areas. Now our demographic is kind of unique because we bump up against the Wichita area, so we got some high density, and then we go clear into Greenwood County, which it's miles per house, not houses per mile. So, but a perfect example, I had a classmate call me, 3 or 4 years ago, wanting to build a house out on our electric lines, and they was all really pretty interested in that until they asked about what kind of internet services out there, and I said, well, out there's really not much. I mean, you can get satellite or something. And that's a problem because his wife had a home business and she had to have good internet access. So, and I've done several studies, wrote a paper on it and stuff, but really, providing broadband service is something, it's become a necessity of life. So, for people to build out in the rural areas and to stay in the rural areas, that it's a service that we found that they need.
Yeah.
So many of you talked about the role of communities. So I think we're talking about ourselves, and then we're also talking about our communities and what our communities need to do to change. And you talked about belonging and being inclusive and being flexible and being experimental and just being committed to things like broadband if we're going to make communities go. So when you think about more of the idea of unification or unity or coming together, however you might want to call it, what do we need for communities to do to come together and embrace some of these changes that we're talking about?
Well, one of the things that we heard—
Go ahead, Lieutenant Governor.
Oh, sorry. One of the things we hear, when we toured last summer for our rural areas was that, there were needs for each region, but the 3 big things was that people wanted a place where they could have a good paying job, where they could raise a family, make enough money to raise a family, and then third, live in a community that was forward thinking or, was concerned about the quality of life. And I think that's maybe one of the things that communities that are successful at least what I've seen, is that they've focused on those quality of life issues. How do they improve so that, again, like Matt, they've got a grocery store, they've got activities for the kids, they've got things to do. And again, those kinds of projects also bring people together for the common good,
Yeah, agreed. And something I was going to talk about was, breaking bread. When you sit down at a dinner table, you start talking, you start finding those things that you have in common, the commonalities. And one thing we did in Kearney County and Lakin specifically was we partnered. We found a number of what you would think of as traditional Southwest Kansas rural families, and partnered them with refugee families from the refugee community, and primarily from the Somalian community. And we had like 3 vans, and we took the Somalian families over to Lakin and dropped them off at the houses, and there would be either someone within the family that spoke English or someone who could translate. And it was really interesting because the traditional family, Southwest Kansas family, had prepared the meal and just having conversation, and they were stunned at how much in common they really had about things that they wanted for their family and they desired. The following weekend, the Somalian families reciprocated and gave a community type meal in the back of one of the stores here. And it was so well received. We were really thinking outside the box when we named it. Guess who's coming to dinner? That was original on our part, of course, but it was really neat, because the majority of the Somalian folks are Muslim, have a Muslim faith, and going into Christian homes and vice versa. And it was amazing. It was fun to watch, especially the children playing. And they could have cared less that there were any differences. As far as they were concerned, they weren't. They're just another human being to play with. And we found that I think a great event that I'd love to continue replicating.
It's important that communities, while each community, whether it's a small town or whatever, has great pride in their community, support their local team, all this kind of stuff. But they also need to work together to better the communities. Perfect example, in our school district, we needed a middle school, but one town wanted it in their town, the other town wanted it in their town, and they sure as heck wasn't going to vote for the other town to get it. And it took years to get past that, but once you're past that, the whole district benefits, so I think the same kind of concept in communities. I sit on a local economic development board in El Dorado, and looking for the opportunities there to draw business into their industrial park. And the concern was, well, can their town, how big of a company can they draw in? Well, the benefit is it's not just what could be drawn into that town, but all the surrounding towns, and communities, because not everybody's going to live in a specific place to work in a specific place. I mean, you look at Wichita, and there's people that drive an hour and a half to, because they want to live out in the country or some small town that they grew up in, but the good jobs in Wichita, so they're willing to commute back and forth. So a good, big company like Spirit Aerosystems in Wichita benefits, any community within an hour's drive, so I think the same concept applies to any of our small communities, that they can work together and develop plans that whether it's keeping people there or drawing business in or whatever, supporting one another to better the whole area.
Well, I think in the smaller communities, there's a lack often of housing where people can move in very large numbers. And then if apartments or such are built, they tend to be higher rent, more expensive, that people making, lower end of income still struggle to live in that town, even though it might be, everything else might be a little cheaper to live. It's finding affordable and quality housing.
Yeah.
So happy to hear us all talking about community and making sure that, you know, the input from everyone is really taken into account. Whatever inequity a community might be facing, broadband, healthcare, childcare, food access, we have to have the people who are most affected by that issue to be the ones that sort of organize and play a leading role in changing that. Us context experts are very well studied, and we know all of these things that historically or traditionally work or do not work, and we've got research and statistics, but like the lived experience is it's so powerful. And if you have someone that actually lives that day-to-day struggle be part of the creative process to come up with solutions that could just be so much more realistic and sustainable. And I mean, have you ever tried going into a community and saying, this is your problem and you need to do this to fix it? Small town Kansas, you might get run out of town with pitchforks if you say something like that. It doesn't work. A better approach is maybe finding the trusted person or even the trusted place like a library or a community center, and asking them, hey, would you gather some local change makers and some local advocates? Let's get together and discuss this. And us authority figures, like, we have a role in uniting communities to embrace change, but we better start off just listening, and doing everything in our power to make sure that it's their ideas that we're going to follow through on.
I think when I heard this question, I heard two parts to that question. What do we need to unify, and how do we embrace change? And I think those are really two separate ideas. I would piggyback or agree with several of the other panelists that I think to find some of that unity, we need to spend time together. Definitely meals, a project, something together where we get past the screens and we're actually engaging with people in some way, shape, or form. I think that's probably one of the hardest things about the last 6 months is we have been disengaged even in our small communities in some ways. But I think the other half of that question, and I think maybe this ties into some of what Matt said too, is where it gets really hard. How many of us really actually embrace change? If we're really, really honest, it's maybe that very small percentage of early adopters that go seek change. Most of us, if things are going okay, we don't want to change, whether that's individually or in a community. And I don't know if sadly, but usually we need something that pushes us to that point where we realize that it's not working, that we need to make a change. Often it's some type of crisis. You mentioned the grocery stores and things like that. I think about in protection, we had somebody that was ready to sell the grocery store, or close the grocery store, excuse me. I think people had heard that threat for years and years and didn't do anything about it. When they were finally, we can't afford to do this any longer, that's when it became a community-owned grocery store. There was a crisis that needed to be solved. Nobody really thought about doing anything until we got pushed to that point. And so I think we have to be very aware that most people, including ourselves that we talk to and engage with, aren't change embracers.
Mm-hmm. That's probably a good thought, Andy. I agree with Matt's stuff too. One of the things I do think we have to discuss in rural Kansas as well, and it's probably true even in urban Kansas, is that sometimes the leaders of our groups or the leaders of the community have been doing it for a very long time, and they're very, very tired, and there's nobody to replace them. In some instances, they don't want to let younger people take over, and so we've got to figure out, how do we transition that? How do we let new people take over? Again, it's change that you can't always control, but we've got to make sure that our younger generation, we're appreciating them and understanding that we want them involved in the situation. And they may do things a little differently, but it's something that they're going to have to carry.
And sometimes that younger generation are people my age in their late 40s.
Yeah.
Well, I want to stay on that just for a second, because when we talk about being inclusive, I will note that every single one of you used the word together, all of you in your responses. So now that you've maybe heard a little bit more of the conversation, what other ideas might you have for how to bring people together? I mean, we have some really great ideas about community dinners and, you know, some of the examples you gave, but how else can we get people to come together, especially when we're so divided?
It's even extra challenging now with COVID. I mean, here we are. This was probably going to be an event in some rural community at some point, a town hall like that, and now we have to do it on Zoom. So yeah, how do we get people together safely, comfortably now? It's even more challenging. I heard a couple of people say it. I mean, food always brings people together. You will travel for a free meal. You will get someone to watch your kids. You'll do all sorts of things for a free meal. And we've actually used that practice to host community conversations. If you just share that there will be a meal, you know, people will show up. But it's such a good question, especially now, just with the nature of COVID and social distancing.
To piggyback on that, or that idea there, that several years ago we had Sunday night meals at the local pool. It was very informal, burgers and hot dogs. Our original goal was to help feed kids who probably weren't getting great meals on a regular basis. And we ended up there would be Sundays we'd have 30 to 40 folks between adults and kids. And it was just a time of fellowship. I think sometimes we get together for a specific purpose too often, and we forget that we really just need to be in community. We need that connection and that conversation. Yes, a shared purpose or a project is a great thing, but I think we just need that time. We don't choose to spend enough time with the people we live with and get to know them outside of what we might perceive as their political position or what they share on Facebook.
Even during COVID, you know, in my neighborhood in Wichita, I live in Riverside, which is, you know, kind of a close-knit community. A community garden is what brought a lot of people together. There's, you know, 50 spots where, you know, people show up. Even during COVID, they've kind of come in to garden, and, you know, they visit, you know, socially distanced and all. And then also, you know, we have a great Facebook group just for Riversiders that we share, you know, what's going on and what's happening. And that's been a great way to know your neighbors. I've been very, very impressed with some of those kinds of things that have been going on, you know, around the state.
Ben or Kendal, any final thoughts on togetherness?
I think, you know, right now, of course, we've got the unique situation of COVID, but I got to believe this is a temporary situation. And then whether it's 2 months, 6 months, or a year, that, you know, vaccines come out and better solutions come out, and we can safely get back to the way we was before COVID, you know, and meeting with people. But, you know, everybody has some different interests. I mean, Lieutenant Governor Rogers talked about the garden. You know, we talk about getting together for meals and whatnot. You got a whole series of, you know, group of people that, you know, sporting events. Your kids are in school. There's a multitude of opportunities, but you have to push the right trigger or button to get people together. And I mean, I think there's points there. A lot of times, certain groups are almost too cliquish, and they don't open up to more people or try to get more people involved. So that's probably the biggest challenge.
Okay. Well, along these lines, one of the things that the Rural Center talks about is this idea of resiliency and creating this resilient future. And maybe, Ben, this is what you're talking about, that maybe there are aspects of this that are temporary, but we've got this future to think about. So I'd like to ask each of you to talk a little bit about your own visions for a more resilient future and some of the things you're doing now to make it possible.
I think human beings are resilient, incredibly resilient. Some of the populations I've worked with as a social worker are addicts, and to see the resilience that people actually have to survive. But one thing that I spend a lot of time doing right now, excuse me, is around integrated voter engagement. And it's primarily with immigrant and refugee populations. But initially, I can remember, first thing I did was set up some registration drives, and registered people to vote. And then I had one person that I'd helped register, and he goes, well, this is awesome. I'm now registered to vote. I know where I go to vote. I know how to vote. I've seen a sample ballot. But I don't know anything about any of the issues or who the candidates are. So I still can't vote because I'm not going to vote in something that may or may not be in my best interest. And I want to participate in democracy. So I've developed an opportunity for them to have town halls with decision makers coming in, and Congressman Marshall was the first one, and he, we had like 8 languages being translated simultaneously in the back of this called the African Shop, and they asked some great questions. In fact, there's one lady said, she'd been here for 15 years. She's voted in every election since she became a citizen. Her children are here, but her husband is still in a refugee camp in another country. And the question is, why is my husband still not here? Great question. But it's, and empowering people to have a voice. And I know earlier, Teresa was talking about the ever important local elections. And that's something that has been a real struggle, is for people to understand that local elections probably affect them more immediately, at least, than the federal elections. But they see that as the primary election. And when we'd have conversations, they say, well, it's not an election year for the president, so there's no election. And it's like, yeah, well, there are, there's county commissioners, city council members, and issues like that, that could affect you through paying higher tax or not, and those kinds of things. So I think it's that opened my eyes to saying, okay, so then I asked the question, like Matt was talking about, that authentic engagement. What is it that you need? And how's the best way to deliver that to you? So how does that delivering the information around what's the difference between city government, county government, state government, and federal government, and how are they intertwined but separate? And how does each affect you? And it's having those conversations. And currently we're connecting like this. And initially, well, in fact, I contacted Wichita, and the city of Wichita's Civic Engagement Academy has given me their curriculum they created 2 years ago, and is allowing me to pilot it out here with the refugee and immigrant populations, and just for me to track. So I'm in the process now of still figuring out how best to deliver that, and what languages, and how, what I'm told from the refugees, we don't want it to be separated. Like one day is Burmese, one day is this, one day is that. We're all together, we're family, we're community, we're all one. We want it to happen with all of us together at one time. So what I'm doing is meeting with young, up and coming, young leaders that have some influence in their community, just getting out of high school, young in college, but with the imams or other elders in the community, they hold some some power because they are bilingual, at least bilingual. Had a meeting earlier today with a guy who speaks 4 languages. But it's, so how do we make this happen and get people excited about wanting to participate in democracy and allowing it to happen?
So when I think about our resiliency and our future, I mean, I'll stick with food because that's why I'm here. So think back to April when the world was just a mess. You know who's having some of the best business that they'd had in years and years and decades? Garden centers. They couldn't keep seeds. They couldn't keep plants. They couldn't keep their soil. We had a back order. We were trying to get 14 yards of soil to amend a community garden, and we had to get it from Miami, Oklahoma, because we couldn't find it anywhere close to us. So that's what I think about our future, like, is using our past. So at the height of the Victory Garden movement at the end of World War II, 40% of fruits and vegetables came from people's backyards and neighborhoods. 40% in the entire country. I mean, it's so much food. So my vision for a more resilient future is just a full-scale resurgence of the Victory Garden movement. Food production can't be any more local than your backyard. It's more than just food too. It brings people together and it makes us healthier, and healthier people live longer and we're happier. Prosperity, American prosperity after the war, and I'll try not to trail off too much. Things were really just doing so great after the Depression and the war that mass food production became extremely common. It was ultra convenient, a very affordable option to get food, and it gave us more times with our friends and our families and our fun because we didn't have to grow that food. And that was fine. But over time, mass food production and preservation started to develop sodas and sweets and chips and all of these filler type foods that have not only no nutritional value, but some of them, really make you a lot less healthy if you eat too many of them. And unfortunately, if you're a low income household, that just might have to be the things that you buy because it's what you can afford. Our food system is so broken now that, so for example, a low-income household might buy 8 McDoubles from McDonald's for dinner because it's about the same price as a farmer's market head of lettuce and tomato and a couple radishes, which is not going to fill the bellies of their families. And so are we going to be full, or are we going to be hungry and a little more healthy? So personally, and it's so hard and there's so many things to it, I'd like to see a resident-led community garden in every city, especially us rural and frontier communities. People work together, we meet our neighbors, we become friends, and we have tomatoes. I mean, it's everything about it's great. And on top of that, put raised bed gardens in people's backyards, or at least those that are capable of working them, and help teach them that you can grow your own food and it's really not that complicated. And I think if one of the things COVID taught us is that the supermarket food will not always be there. If you're growing your own food, you've always got something to feed your family. And so that's my vision of, I've been doing that type of work for about 9 years, and that idea has been in my head for so long. And it's a very complicated one, but it's certainly a hand-up approach, like get people to work together to improve their own community and their lives. But I could go on for a long time on that.
Well, we erected 2 greenhouses in Kearney County, one in Lake and one in Deerfield. The one in Deerfield is at the school, but it's open to the community. It's at no cost to anyone. But also Deerfield uses it to teach their students how to grow vegetables and that type of thing. And then the one in Laken is on the hospital grounds, and people in assisted living that love to garden, spend time there, but it's also open to the community as well. And so I hear you with the access to healthy foods. And sometimes in rural communities, it is very difficult. You talked earlier, some of you, about grocery stores not being around. My mother's almost 90, lives in Alton. It's a 30-mile round trip for her to buy groceries. And, you know, now she's where she isn't comfortable driving. I'm not comfortable with her driving. So that's incredibly important. But something else that I learned in Lakin was working with a group of Hispanic females. Primarily, they were all Spanish as a first language. Some spoke English well, some not. They said, I want to eat healthy. I want my family to eat healthy, but I don't know how. I don't know what foods to buy, and if I did, I don't know how to prepare them. So we started a group with them, teaching them how to read labels, the calories, the sodium, the sugars, and the cholesterol, and all this, or you know, the saturated fats and the other fats, and teaching them to read the labels. And then it was like, okay, teaching them to prepare a meal, and them having hands-on learning to prepare the meal, and they'd take it home to their family, and they were so excited. Well, now they are the ones teaching how to read the labels, how to buy the food, and how to prepare it to others. And it's just, now it's sustainable, and they love doing it. That, I mean, they look so forward to doing it each month. And it's really, you know, it's kind of a one person, one family at a time. But it's, you know, there's a difference between wanting to and knowing how. And so that's something I think we can help support people in being resilient as well. So grow their vegetables, but then how do you prepare them?
I guess I thought about this on a smaller scale, and my experiences are a little bit different than the two stories that Matt, or the experiences Matt and Kendal both shared. As I think about a resilient future, and you need to know, Sarah knows this, but you need to know this about me. I'm a planner and an organizer, and I want to know the way forward. We're going to do step A and step B and step C, and I like those in order. I'm trained as a mathematician. Those things make sense to me. But I think personally, and then on a larger scale, I think about it as I look at farming, as I look at students in school and our small school educational system and those kinds of things. I think we have to get outside the idea that there's just one way to achieve our goals. And that doesn't matter if you're trying to figure out how to erect a high tunnel in a small community, bring food to a community, survive on a farm. I think we have to realize, we have to first recognize what is our goal. You know, is the goal to farm like somebody's always farmed before you, or is the goal to find a way for your family to stay on that farm? And how are you going to get there? And so I think there's that great meme on the internet. You know, you have that plan for your life and it's a nice straight line, and then the actual one is a curve that goes every direction. I think we have to be open to those curves, not just individually, but on community and statewide level. How do we head different directions to achieve that goal that we want to get to?
Those are all good. I appreciate, I've learned so much just already tonight. You know, part of my job is to address policy issues that can help rural Kansas. Our job is not to save rural Kansas. That's got to be, like as Matt said, that's going to have to come from local leaders. But the one thing I do see, I think, for resilience, and a big part of my job, is to talk about rural Kansas in our urban areas. You know, my kids had grandparents on the farm in small towns. My grandkids don't, you know, because they have us. And so people are farther away from their community or from their parents and grandparents than ever. But I tell my neighbors in Wichita and Johnson County and whatnot that when rural Kansas succeeds, urban Kansas succeeds. And, you know, we came across some stats from Wichita State that showed that a 1% increase of income in rural Kansas equates into at least a 0.5% increase in wages in urban Kansas. So when rural Kansas wages go up, you know, it funnels to the urban areas. And so it's beneficial for our rural areas to succeed. So we need to remind our urban neighbors and our cousins, so to speak, that their interest is the success of rural Kansas as well.
Ben, I think that might tie in neatly with whatever I'm guessing you might be about to say.
Well, you know, it's very interesting, the you know, the different perspectives and the great support systems and the ideas that that each one of you have. You know, the Matt with the food, and Kendal with the support of the minorities or the bilinguals or immigrants, whatever, to different groups of people and supporting those. And those are very important. But I look at, you know, things, of course, I don't have those same opportunities or skill sets. So, because if I'm going to do a garden, I'm planting weeds. I know I'm planting stuff, but all I get's weeds. So I have to rely on my sister. She lives down the road. She's a, you know, garden master, you know. But looking at different things, you know, like affordability, we've worked hard at the electric co-op to keep rates low. We've been creative on our rates. Since 2012, our cost per kilowatt hour for our customers or members has gone down consistently. You know, it's whereas typically the rates have gone up. So we've done that by creative rate design and different efficiencies, you know, implementing a solar farm and different things like that. So striving to keep the costs down, or at least the ability for people to keep their costs down, is important. Looking at obviously the broadband service, again, you know, people, if they can't get on the internet, if they can't communicate, if they can't do business, if they can't do school at home or work at home now, especially, they're in trouble. It's amazing what seemed like, you know, a luxury, you know, it's no big deal. Somebody, you know, the internet went out or whatever, you know, a few years ago. Now it's a crisis, you know. I mean, especially, you know, if you're streaming the Chiefs game over TV, if your internet goes out now, you're really in trouble. You know, those are luxuries, but people are really dependent on it. And you know, I think you mentioned earlier telemedicine and different things like that. Those are services that really, you know, from my standpoint personally, probably not a big deal. I got a hospital, you know, 10 minutes away. But that's not the case for a lot of rural areas. You know, people don't have a hospital that they can get to in just a few minutes. It's maybe an hour or two. And if you need really critical care, you know, it's several hours. But the ability to do telemedicine and, you know, connect with a medical professional and use the computer video to, you know, not only describe, but even show an injury or something and determine whether is this real emergency or can I, you know, get by until I can make it to the hospital or that kind of thing like that. You know, can I get treatment without having to drive a long way? So the broadband is becoming very, very much more critical. You know, and in the rural areas, it's a challenge. I mentioned earlier our Greenwood County electric members, you know, it's more miles per house. Well, to build internet out, even with a microwave and wireless type connection, the money it costs to build the infrastructure and just provide the service never pays for itself. I mean, you could have it out there for 30 years and you'd still be losing money on it. It never recovers. Now, there's some recent grant money with the Sparks and the COVID stuff that we've applied for. Hopefully we can get, you know, some of those more distant areas. If we get that, then we can provide some service in those areas. But density is a huge, huge deal with providing broadband service because the infrastructure is so expensive to develop. So, and then, then you need to be able to make the internet affordable for people, and you think about, well, low income people need to be able to get to the internet, but if you can't, as a company, you can't put in the infrastructure and never recover your costs, you can't operate as a business. So it's a catch-22 in a lot of those areas. So so I guess this conversation is really probably related to Lieutenant Governor Rogers, is any kind of funding opportunities that can be developed for rural areas, especially the low density areas. They'll never have true broadband service without some kind of funding assistance.
Well, and actually we have a new program, Ben. We do have the Sparks money from the CARES Act that, unfortunately that has to be used by 12/31, but we have
Right.
some programs that are going to be done on that. But one of the good things that happened before the legislature stopped in March was passing the 10-year transportation plan. And we have a broadband grant program in there that basically would give up to 50% matched with a local nonprofit, telco, rural telephone, whatever, rural electric that wants to expand their broadband. It's not tied to any particular type of technology, but it needs to be scalable and, increasable. Right now, that's $5 million a year for the first 3 years, then $10 million thereafter. And so, that's $85 million that we'll have for expanding, broadband. That's just half. The other half would come from private places. So that's a start. That's the first funding that we've ever been able to put in. So we're excited about that. And one of the other things that I think is really exciting too is, the previous administration, towards the end, Governor Collier, they had put together a plan to do a map of broadband coverage. And as a state, we had to pay some money for that. But one of the things it showed, they did 185,000 tests for telephone service. And these were in areas that telephone companies or the big providers said there was coverage, and 65% of those tests failed. 65%. Well, what that meant was, because they proved that, prior to that, the federal government was not allowing any grant money to come to Kansas for that reason, because they were, quote unquote, covered well. And so they were able to prove that it wasn't covered well. So we'll actually be able to get some more federal grants from that standpoint. So there's some good things happening, but I really see broadband as the rural electrification of our generation. If COVID has kind of proven it, that we need it for schooling, we need it for health, we need it for going to church, we need it for purchasing things, all those kind of things. And we heard it often even a year ago before COVID. If you want to start a business, if you want to come home, we've got some folks up in Northwest Kansas that are doing rural remote work settings. We've got to have better broadband. And even for precision agriculture, a lot of the ag equipment now requires much better broadband. So we've got to keep pushing that. And I think, again, for urban Kansans, it's important to them as they travel in rural Kansas. One of the most frustrating things I hear from my neighbors is, I was out so-and-so and I couldn't get telephone service. And I thought, well, what about the folks that live out there that, have to stand on a certain hill just to be able to get phone service? So I hear you. So
well, and I think that's a great place to stop this conversation. The chat box is blowing up with excitement for broadband, which is exciting to me to come to a rural center event and have all of these points be so intertwined. And that I think this conversation has been so good because it's been so diverse in the topics. So, and everything is important. And I think we could go on for another, probably at least hour, even if the Chiefs were not playing, to keep talking about this. So I would like to say thank you to everyone who has participated in the panel, and I will kick it back to Natalie and Ryan for some of the Q&A. Thank you all so much.